I want to start with a confession. The report you're about to hear is not something that I threw together over a weekend. I'm the author of The Obsolescence of the Federal Reserve. It's just a quick little report, but I've been working on it for quite a while. And because this is not a finance topic, this is more of a civilization topic. And the Federal Reserve isn't just a bank. It's just a policy committee. It's not just rates. It's an architecture of power. And when you understand that, you stop seeing the Fed as a technical institution. And you start seeing it as something much more serious. A mechanism that determines who gets access to money, at what price, and under what circumstances. Now, to be clear, this is not a rant. It's not doom. The report that I wrote examines facts, history, and geopolitics, and then draws reasoned conclusions. And the conclusion is big. And that's the central banking, at least the way we've known it, or it may become obsolete. Not because money just disappears, because it doesn't, but because the foundation of power is shifting again. And if I'm right, and even if I'm only partly right, then the average investor is going to get crushed emotionally because they will keep trying to invest like the last 30 years still exist. And this talk ends with something that most people overlook, cash flow. Because in a world of institutional failure and geopolitical restructuring, cash flow becomes a form of independence. Now let's compress the entire report that I did in a single idea. For decades, global power was based on abstract systems. Currency credibility, central bank signaling, interest rate policy, debt markets guessing, predictions. But the world is shifting back to tangible power, energy, minerals, choke points, trade routes, hard assets. And as power shifts from abstract control to tangible control, well, the Fed becomes less necessary and potentially counterproductive. And that's what obsolescence means right here. Not that it loses centrality and that its tools stop working the way that they used to. Most people talk about the Fed like it's the engine of the economy. I don't. The Fed is more like, kind of like a thermostat. It can adjust the temperature, but it's not the furnace. It's not the fuel. It's not the electricity, and it's not the food supply. If the world's power is moving back to fuel and electricity, then this thermostat that we're talking about becomes less important. The Fed may still exist, but it may matter less and less as time goes on. To critique the Fed honestly, we have to understand why it was created. The late 1800s and early 1900s were full of financial instability. Banking panics weren't bad market days. They were system seizures. Banks closed. Credit vanished. Businesses died. Payrolls stopped. The Panic of 1907 is one of those big triggers, and you have to picture an early industrial America running without a real emergency liquidity mechanism. If the economy is like a city, then bank panics were like citywide fires. In the US, well, they didn't have a fire department at that time. So on paper, the Fed was kind of pitched as, well, a stabilizer, a lender of last resort mechanism, a modern central structure to prevent panic. And that's the public explanation. But the deeper question is, who is it designed for? Boom. And now we go to the real origin story. In 1910, a group of powerful financial figures met in secret on Jekyll Island on the coast of Georgia. This is not speculation. Jekyll Island is a documented historical event about the invention of the Federal Reserve. And this is where The Creature from Jekyll Island, the book, which I highly recommend, becomes culturally relevant. Not because we need to adopt every claim, but because it points to a truth that should make every citizen pause. Major money architecture was designed privately, and then it was sold publicly. And I want you to think about the logic. When something is designed in secret, it rarely is designed primarily for the people who will live under it. It may include a public benefit, but the primary benefits tend to favor the people who had access to the blueprint phase. And that's how power really works. Here's a general rule. When they design it in secret, it may help you, but it isn't for you. And that doesn't require conspiracy. That's just governance. The real product is not monetary tools. The Fed's real product is belief, credibility, legitimacy, because a fiat system runs on trust, the way a plane runs on fuel. And when the trust gets punctured, especially through accountability failures, the entire machine becomes unstable. So in the report, I first start talking the accountability crisis. And that's where we begin. It addresses documented concerns about discrepancies between public statements under oath and reported internal planning details regarding renovations and cost estimates. Now, let's be honest here. At the surface, somebody might say, who cares about a building? But that's the wrong lens. The issue is not concrete and steel, because the issue is truth under oath. Because when you ask the public to trust you with their money system, you can't afford credibility cracks. And the institutional posture is described in the report as equally alarming. Instead of welcoming accountability, criticism is framed as an attack on independence. Now, let me make this plain. A central bank can't say we're independent, so no oversight is allowed. And in a free society, no institution is above accountability, or at least it shouldn't be, right? If you're on a plane and the pilot says, well, hey, everybody, everything is fine, and you later find out that the cockpit was not fine or the engine was on fire, you don't say, well, at least the pilot was independent. No, you say, I need the truth because my life is on this plane and your wealth is on this plane. So now let's zoom out a little bit. Because the accountability crisis alone damages legitimacy, but the bigger thesis is more geopolitical, we've got to kind of dive a little bit below the surface because we're moving from an abstract power to more of a tangible power. And in the abstract era, it looks like debt markets, credit bank statements, interest rates, monetary expansion, the stuff we're all used to, credibility. In a tangible power world, power looks like this: oil, minerals, trade routes, food, geography, right? And if tangible power dominates again, the Fed becomes less relevant because you can't print oil, you can't print rare earth minerals, you can't print shipping lanes. Now let's talk about oil. Oil is not just fuel, oil is sovereignty. It's negotiation power. Oil is military readiness. Oil is food production. It's transportation. It's the bloodstream of an industrial civilization. Historically, the global oil trade has largely been dollar denominated, reinforcing global demand for dollars. Now, you're going to hear sloppy claims online like Saudi is forced to sell oil in dollars. That's not really the correct way to see it, but the system dynamic is real. Energy trade supports oil dominance indirectly. In this report that I did, Venezuela is used as part of the argument about a hard asset leverage. And when power is recentered on energy control, money credibility becomes secondary to physical supply. So what the heck am I talking about here? Well, currency is kind of the receipt. Energy is the product. And the Fed can influence the receipt, but those who control the energy control the product. The next thing in the report is Greenland. Greenland matters. Why? Well, because rare earth minerals power modern technology and they power defense. Arctic routes may become strategically intangible power world. Greenland isn't an island. It's like a hardware store. It's a warehouse of inputs. So if you can control that hardware store, you control what gets built. If you can control the minerals, you control production. And if you can control production, well, then you can control leverage. So now let's talk about what I consider to be one of the most shocking facts in the modern finance world, and that's gold. The US government holds massive gold reserves, or at least we think they do, but gold on the official books is valued at a statutory price of about $42 per fine troy ounce, and that's been fixed since 1973. Now, this isn't an opinion, this is an accounting reality. Think about what that means. Gold trades in the real world at a market price. You guys know that. It's buyers and sellers coming together, but the government carries it on its books at $42. That's not bookkeeping trivia. That's leverage. It's optionality. If you undervalue something long enough, you create the ability to revalue it later, and very dramatically. And revaluation events are how systems recapitalize their confidence. If you own Manhattan, for example, and kept it priced on your balance sheet at 1930 values, well, that's not an accident. It's basically a lever, a pretty strong one too, right? Okay, let's start to put some other things into the mix here. Let's talk about Bitcoin. Crypto is no longer a fringe topic. It's not just retail speculation. It's a geopolitical and monetary issue. And the current administration's posture has been more constructive toward digital assets in official language. And that really matters. Why? Because governments don't bless competing monetary systems unless they see strategic value. And strategic value can include a few things: global competitiveness, financial innovation dominance, and reserve diversification narratives, and then maybe even those little pressure relief valves that economies and governments need. Bitcoin is scarcity without permission, and that makes it threatening and useful. Now, here's the part of that that's slightly controversial. I'm going to label this properly. It's not a promise and it's not prophecy. This is scenario analysis, okay? But it's plausible enough that serious investors must consider it. The structure is this. The Fed credibility weakens and has been weakening. Geopolitical power shifts to tangible things. Dollar dominance needs reinforcement, and US gold is massively undervalued on the books. And Bitcoin now enters the strategic narrative. So a future recapitalization event could look like this. They revalue gold upwards, okay? They do a full book value reset upward from $42.22. Plus Bitcoin now is a reserve adjacent to gold, and it's an adjacent asset with a strategic backstop narrative. Would they call it a new gold standard? No way, because that implies restraint. They would call it something else. They would call it resilience, modernization, stability, reserve strategy, security, or a reimagining of the world's currencies. They're not going to say we're limiting ourselves. They're going to say, hey, we're protecting you. Everything is good. This is going to be great. Same function, different marketing. Now, I want to tie this back to history, because if you don't study history, you might repeat it. Andrew Jackson opposed centralized banking power, and after the second bank era, the U.S. operated a long period of time without a central bank. And this matters because it destroys a propaganda idea that a central bank is like a law of physics, right? It's not. It's a design choice. And design choices change, right? So if the report that I put together is correct, or even close, then the biggest investing risk is not just market volatility. It's psychological volatility. The average investor will respond to institutional shifts by trying to become a prophet, right? I always say, don't try to be Nostradamus. They're going to try to predict the next policy change, the next election, the next war, the next rate cut, the next market crash, right? This is not investing. It's gambling with a spreadsheet. Most investors invest like sailboat racers. They need good wind. They need calm conditions. They need perfect timing. And cash flow investors invest like they're building submarines. And submarines don't require perfect weather, right? They do not need wind. They move through storms. And cash flow is like the submarine. So I believe so much in cash flow investing because one of the things it does is it reduces dependence on policy predictability, regime stability. Cash flow creates patience, it creates flexibility, and it creates solvency. And one more thing it does is it creates optionality. And optionality, like we've been talking about here, is power. In unstable systems, the winners are not the smartest. They're the most solvent. They are the ones who can wait. They can buy when others are panicking. They can roll. They can hedge. They can structure. And cash flow gives you the ability to behave like an institution and not like a victim. So that's why I put this little report together. Not to scare people, not to get clicks, but to point to a structural shift. The Fed was created in an era of panics, shaped privately at Jekyll Island, Georgia. Born in 1913 in alignment with a major tax transformation. Now it's facing an accountability crisis. And now power is shifting back toward tangible assets and money architecture. And that moves towards scarcity narratives again. And if that arc is true, then the retail investor who relies on hope, well, I think they're in trouble. But the system investor, the disciplined investor, the cash flow investor doesn't need perfect predictions. All they need is the right underlying assets, the right risk management, and repeatable income. Because in the future, cash flow isn't just nice to have. Cash flow is independence. Cash flow is survival. Cash flow is control.